Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out the radio version of the show every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern on WDJY 99.1 in Atlanta. We also air on a podcasting network in Los Angeles called the 405 Media. There's a TV version of the show that airs on KMVT 15 in Silicon Valley at 8 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday nights. Both versions of the show air in other states. For these show times, plus past episodes, please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com. I want to invite all of you in the Building the Future community to join me at SUPEX, the Startup Expo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, this July 26th, where I'll be the MC. SUPEX is one of the largest and best startup conferences in the U.S. and the official gathering of the Building the Future community this summer. SUPEX has cutting-edge content, a cool startup competition, and a half-day forum this year called #WomenForWomen, the largest gathering in the U.S. in 2018 of angel groups, seed funds, and VC funds focused on female founders and female entrepreneurs. For more information, visit www.sup-x.org. I hope to see all my Building the Future friends there. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Matt Barnard. He's the founder at Podknife. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think kind of what you guys are doing at Podknife is actually really kind of important in the podcasting space. Well, even just in kind of the media space, to be fair. But maybe before we get into all that fun stuff, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in New York City, in Queens specifically, and have lived in and around New York City for most of my life.
Okay, very cool. So obviously, like, podcasting isn't necessarily your day job. So before we kind of get into that, I want to get to know kind of your history a little bit more. You went to university, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I went to university up in Boston. Like I said, I'm from New York, but I was in Boston for a few years studying broadcast journalism. And that's, my plan there was I'm a really big sports fan, and I was trying to marry a few different interests of mine. I was really into writing, and I've been having people say things to me about my voice my entire life. That'd be good for radio, that would be good for TV, that kind of stuff. So I was trying to stay close to sports.
Sure.
With understanding my athletic limitations, trying to do something in that world. During the time I was in school there, I realized sort of the practical realities of working in sports and having to move to small markets all over the place in all likelihood. So thinking that through, and I found myself in a long-term relationship with the woman who's now my wife, and realizing sort of the practical realities of pursuing a career there. I made a choice to do something that seemed a little more stable and moved back to New York. Went to law school and got a degree in law, and graduated into the teeth of the financial crisis in the summer of 2008.
Sure. So
I got a job. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, just before we kind of get into that, what made you choose law?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of benefits to going to law school, whether you're confident you want to be a lawyer or not, just in terms of the way that you're taught to think. And I thought those would be skills that would be applicable in a lot of different paths I might choose to pursue afterwards, whether I was going to be a lawyer or not. It also something that had always been an interest of mine from when I was younger as well. Just sort of the study of law and the way the law is applied and has evolved over time. So I was interested on an academic level as well. So it also just seemed like a good way to get back to New York and get on a more concrete track. It seemed at that point, maybe pre-financial crisis, a little more so than post, that being a lawyer was a pretty stable way to have a foundation to raise a family and start a life, that sort of thing.
Sure. So you mentioned you graduated kind of during the financial crisis. Walk us through kind of that journey.
Yeah, so it's a tricky time to be looking for a job.
Sure.
I actually got married got married in the summer of 2008, and came back to New York. I was looking for work, and it was a tough sell at that moment.
Sure.
Ended up getting a job a few months later, working in the Attorney General's office in New York, and I was there for a couple of years before transitioning to the job I've had more recently for the last 6 years or so, working in corporate litigation in private practice.
Okay. No, I think that's really great. So I want to kind of transition into, you founded Podknife. What exactly made you kind of decide to found Podknife, and what exactly is it?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll take a little step back here, because
Sure.
Podknife is actually the second project like this I've embarked on.
Okay.
When I was working through my career as a lawyer, I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs kind of reach a point where they look at all the cards on the table and try to talk themselves out of pursuing something that they're really passionate about, see if they
Sure.
can find a way to do it. And I reached a point where I couldn't help myself trying to build something for the consumer internet, having watched it develop as we have over the course of our lives, and having ideas as to how you can improve things, and cool things that would be that you could add to the marketplace. So the first thing I pursued started about 6 years ago, working with an independent contractor on something that was called a product called Text Market, which was a tool for publishing and distributing text. The idea being that people are producing text in various forms all over the internet, whether it was in the form of articles or blog posts or social media.
Sure.
It would be useful to have a place that you could pull all that text in from various places and then distribute it to people who are interested in it, distribute it and sell it under certain circumstances to people who are interested in it, to encourage the creators of that content to keep making it, and also to provide an easy way for people to get access to that content. So worked on that project for several years with a developer, but I think it being my first venture along these lines, and not fully appreciating the complexity of what would be entailed in building it and selling it to people and all that kind of stuff, we kind of ran out of steam after a few years. But I think it was really, really instructive for me in sort of clarifying the way I would pursue a future project, and that's where we get to Podknife, which I started working on about 2.5 years ago, which is really born out of my own needs. I'm a longtime podcast listener. I've been listening for a good dozen years.
Wow. And
a longtime Android user as well. And as any Android using podcast listener knows, the system really hasn't been built for Android users.
Totally.
From early on. So I had a eureka moment, which kind of just put the spotlight on something I'd been feeling for a long time, when I realized that I not only couldn't leave a review on iTunes, which it was known as iTunes at the time, for a podcast I was interested in, but I couldn't even really read reviews from my phone beyond the first 3 that appear on the iTunes web version of any particular podcast page that they have. So
Sure.
I realized that this is a problem that other people are going to be bumping up against as well. So I thought, let me try to apply some of the lessons that I'd learned in terms of design and sort of building product from Text Market, and apply those to a new product that has become Podknife.
Sure. So I think, like, obviously there is and was a need when you started kind of Podknife, but for people that maybe haven't heard of it, what exactly do you guys do at Podknife? Because I think it's actually quite interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So the way the podcast information is generally distributed to all sorts of players, or websites, wherever you see information about podcasts on the internet, is through these RSS feeds, which are fantastic in the sense that they have inspired a lot of development of podcast-related products. You can start a website like Podknife, or like any one of the other websites that are out there, or other podcast player applications, where you can pull in information that's being pushed out by publishers all over the world, and that's fantastic. But what's different about Podknife is that we're taking that information that's coming in the RSS feeds, and we're augmenting it with information that we're finding elsewhere on the web that's publicly available, to sort of flesh out the information that you can get about podcasts. For me, part of the issue in dealing with iTunes over time, which of course was my primary introduction to the world of podcasts, like for so many people, was just in finding the inconsistencies that maybe had to do with categorization, where you'd have podcasts that are categorized in a particular way by a publisher, but there's no sort of oversight that is making sure that lines up across the entire universe of podcasts. I mean, you might have someone like who's creating a new podcast, who's tacking on an automotive tag or a TV and film tag when maybe their podcast only tangentially touches on these subjects, and you have that happening across the entire universe of hundreds of thousands of podcasts, and that ultimately really garbles up, how useful this tool that iTunes is offering can be when you have all this noise that's hasn't been really looked at by anyone and filtered and curated in a thoughtful way.
Sure.
So what we've done with Podknife is from the outset sort of taken a more top-down approach, added a bunch of additional detail that we can find elsewhere on the web, like who hosts the podcast, what's their Twitter handle, where is the podcast produced, more specifically, what does this podcast cover, beyond those traditional categories that you're used to seeing. And, ultimately that adds up to providing a level of detail and accessibility of podcast information that really goes beyond what you can find elsewhere.
Sure. No, and I think for people that maybe don't know, iTunes didn't really make any changes to their podcasting platform for years, probably even maybe closer to 5+ years, at least in my opinion. So I think like what you guys are doing at Podknife was kind of much needed, right? Because you're right. Like if you didn't use an iPhone, even on an iPhone, I think that it was still kind of a not that great of experience. I think it's gotten better in the last couple of years. They've seemed to care more about it. I think partly because podcasting has kind of become more mainstream, and I think a lot more kind of well-known people have decided to do a show, and I think it's great. Like, I'm sure whether you listen to their podcast or not, but like Joe Rogan and Adam Carolla and Mark Maron, like these guys make a really good living off of being kind of the top podcasters on the planet. They obviously do other stuff as well, but I think, and there's tons of celebrities now doing it, and other kind of well-known people doing podcasts, which I think is great. And those shows are easy to kind of find if you just Google it. But some of the kind of shows just done by regular people that maybe you haven't heard of, there's a lot of really, really good shows, and it can be hard going through, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of podcasts in a category, right? Where what you guys have done is you guys are kind of self-selected and building a network based on, like you said a few minutes ago, with more content, so it's more relevant to what I'm actually searching for, and categorization and location and tagging and that kind of thing. Is that kind of a fair or like overview kind of statement of? Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, like you said, I mean, there are certain podcasters, people who come in with a massive advantage, right? I mean, if you have, a huge Twitter following and you're able to, let people know about your podcast, through that, or you have, some, sort of TV access, or, you're a musician or something like that. I mean, you have, ways to get your message out there really easily, and you see some of these podcasts that are produced by people who are well known, rocket to the top of the charts, right? I mean, you see people who, are able to find instant success, and that's great. But I mean, I feel like it ultimately is a really small fraction of the podcast world that is like that. I mean, and a big part of the beauty of podcasting, from my perspective, is just how easy it is to do it if you're not someone like that. I mean, in terms of just getting something recorded and getting it online. I mean, what's required to produce a podcast is so simple, right? I mean, you need a computer with a microphone, you need an internet connection,
yep,
and something to say, right? And really, what it is that you have to say is almost incidental, right? I mean, the point is, maybe you're going to find an audience saying what you want to say and talking about what you want to talk about, and the door is really open for anybody. So, I mean, part of what's animated me in putting Podknife together is really keeping an eye out for these independent podcasts, bringing them in and displaying them, right alongside podcasts that are being produced by some of the largest entities, whether that's, an individual like, Joe Rogan, as you mentioned, or, someone like, NPR or WNYC,
Totally.
where they're not going to have any trouble, getting the word out. But, the smaller podcasts, they have something also maybe awesome to say, and maybe what they need is, some encouragement in the early days of, putting together what they're putting together as their show and as their content is maturing. So, yeah, I mean, like, giving people more access to find those folks is a big part of what I'm trying to do.
Sure. And just, I guess, in full disclosure, like, you added the show to Podknife a few months ago. That's kind of how we connected and met. And then, we just got kind of chatting. We had a call, and I thought we should maybe talk about the podcasting space, because for me, it's been super valuable. It's been fun. It's been interesting. And I find that, I'm hoping that you and I can maybe inspire, even if it's just like one person or a handful of people, to at least consider doing their own podcast, right? Because I think we're at an interesting time right now, and you touched on it, like getting started, you could use the mic even on your laptop or your computer, like you can go buy a $80 mic or something like that to get started. And then to actually record, there's a handful of ways that you can record, but some software to record is like $30 one-time kind of fee. So if you have a laptop and you buy a $70 mic and $30 recording software, you're in the game for $100, right? And you could be posting online. There's free sites to post. There's paid sites that are $10-15+ a month, depending on what you kind of need. So for around $100, you could be podcasting in, a matter of days, right? I think the barrier to entry is so small now. And I think the other thing that I really want to kind of get people thinking about, and I want your thoughts on, like for people that have probably listened to the show, they know that it airs on some FM stations. It airs kind of on, obviously, some podcasting networks and some digital radio stations. But I basically send the same MP3 file to FM as I do to the podcasting channels. So I record one file and edit one file and then post it to all the different platforms. So the term podcast is just kind of, not that it's irrelevant, it's just the actual file that you create to send the different mediums is no different. At least it's been my experience in kind of, the 2.5 years that I've been doing this. How do you kind of describe what a podcast is or could be for people that are maybe still don't really understand what a podcast kind of is?
Sure. So I think what defines a podcast to me is that it's distributed via RSS. Via RSS.
Sure.
I think that doesn't preclude being distributed in other formats as well. I mean, certainly that's completely viable, and I think you could have something that I would consider a podcast that could also appear as a TV show or a radio show or,
Sure.
or what have you. I think the on-demand aspect of podcasting is also a defining element. I mean, that in a way that really distinguishes itself from traditional radio or TV. Obviously, you could use recording devices, DVR, or what have you, to record with on TV too. But the idea that you could be walking around essentially and have your podcast content available for you, at the press of a button, right? I mean, whenever you need it, your podcast is there for you, and that it doesn't require your eyes. I mean,
Sure.
I feel like this is another key piece that makes podcasting so fantastic from my perspective. Is, when we live really busy lives, a lot of us. I mean, I know I certainly don't have the headspace to devote my eyes to many forms of entertainment, whether that's watching movies and TV and that kind of stuff. But I mean, I have room for podcasts. I mean,
Sure.
my ears are free. And a lot of times, whether you're going for a run or you're doing stuff around the house, or I mean, in a lot of jobs, you're doing work that you don't need to be putting all of your brain power into. I mean, you can escape via what you're hearing through your ears. And podcasts, I think, are beautiful in that way. So I mean, you have the ease of production, the relative ease of production. I mean, and the door that's open to so many people. Being able to bypass any of the traditional gatekeepers for media that have often gotten in people's way, and it's a really easy format to consume as well.
Sure. The other thing I think, just to get people thinking about it, is a lot of people listen to kind of podcasts, on their commute, whether they're driving or they're on the train or bus or whatnot. And like, you can download a podcast to your device, so you don't actually have to use data. You can basically be offline, or if you're flying, you can listen to these shows, right, as you're kind of maybe, just chilling on the airplane, right, and killing some time while you're getting to your destination. So where, traditional kind of radio, that can be a challenge sometimes, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think the other thing that I kind of wanted to mention is the great thing about kind of the podcast, and you alluded to it earlier a little bit, is on a site like even Podknife, you could have a show by like somebody famous, and then right next to it in the same list, you could have a show by somebody that just started a couple of months ago that, their show kind of got some traction, right? So it almost kind of levels the playing field for anybody, can basically be just as popular or right up against somebody that's, really well known, which I think is actually really, really cool, that the barrier to entry is basically kind of gone now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, to me, it's a really inspiring and motivating piece of this, to think that you can really get to some of the voices that have been underrepresented traditionally in media. I mean, by reducing the barrier to entry to the point that we have in podcasting. I mean, there's no reason why any particular person with any particular point of view who wants to speak on any particular subject, can't put it out there, try to find an audience. I mean, it's by no means guaranteed, but this is the same sort of, risks that people take in putting themselves out there in any capacity, right? I mean, in any form of media, you don't know that you're going to find people who are going to be interested in what you're going to do, but at least you can put it out there and let the marketplace decide and try to let people know about what you're doing. So, I think, in a way that is not necessarily the case on other sites and in other apps, on Podknife, I really have tried from the beginning to focus on putting the spotlight on some of these smaller podcasts that are being produced by people who don't have a ton of experience and who are not coming through traditional radio stations or more professionalized podcasting networks that don't have the kind of resources that go into some of your more highly produced radio shows, whether you're talking about, your Radio Lab or anything like that, which, those shows are awesome, right? I mean, then they put a tremendous amount of work into them, but you're dealing with a different thing, right? I mean, like my favorite podcast is one that's called Dunked On. It's a basketball podcast.
Okay.
And it's produced, and I mean, there's no production at all. I mean, it's like, it's like two guys talking. I mean, and they're just that good, I mean,
yeah.
And I think, you find that kind of dynamic all over the place in the podcasting world, where, the people who are talking are the people you want to hear from, and it's really as simple as that. They don't need to spend hours in post-production. They can record something and they can put it out there, and it's going to be good because it's what you're looking for. And, you find the audience over time, you're able to develop that, and it's a beautiful thing, right? I mean, that's the promise of podcasting, I think, really.
No, totally. And I think just to kind of even touch on what you just mentioned, like, basically you listen to like a niche basketball podcast, right? There's tons of podcasts that are basically, for the most part, not every niche has been kind of talked about, but if you just want to talk about, a movie or episodes of TV shows or a specific character in something, like, there might be a show about it already, and if there's not, maybe you start that show up, right? And try to reach out to people and actually get them out there. I think, at least when I started the show, and I've kind of talked to other people that have done shows, is reach out to people that you kind of admire, that have kind of followed maybe their career a little bit. Obviously, some of them maybe like A-list celebrity types you probably won't get on your first few episodes, but you'd be surprised how many people, if you just reach out to them, are willing to kind of help, right? And I think a really good example is some of my first shows. Like, I got one of the early investors in Tesla on the show. I've had some guys, writers that, did some huge kind of books for some well-known people. I've had some kind of bigger names on the show, a lot of them because I just asked and reached out to them, right? Some said no, some said, sure, why not? I've had a show a while ago where they launched a magazine, and their first issue had the CEO of Whole Foods, and they just reached out to him and said, we want to launch this magazine, and we want a really good kind of first cover story. And so, I think most people in North America have kind of heard of Whole Foods, right? So I think part of the thing that I want to kind of get across as well is, it's great if you interview your family and friends, maybe when you're starting out, but you should also kind of shoot for the people that you potentially really, really want on the show. And some of them will say yes. It might take a few months. It might take maybe a year, but some of them will actually say yes, because I think a lot of times people forget that a lot of successful people that you idolize were where you are today, right? And somebody helped them along the way. And the people that, got helped by people as they were kind of coming up in their field feel like a lot of them feel obligated to do the same and pay it back, right? And I think we don't realize that a lot. And I didn't realize that until I kind of started doing it a couple of years ago, right? And I think in full kind of honesty and disclosure, one of the big reasons I did the show was to get over my fear of public speaking. So, I think everybody kind of has their own motivations, good or bad, to why they want to do a show. But I think selfishly for me, it was to kind of get over my fear of public speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, people, I think, one of the reasons to start a venture, whether it's a show like you have, or another type of podcast, or even Podknife in my case, is to kind of build some track record, right? I mean, build some credibility, build some confidence in what you're doing, and build some expertise, right? I mean, that other people might want to draw on and be a part of, or tap into that kind of thing over time. And I think the way we're talking about the relative ease of getting into the game as a podcaster. I mean, and never mind the ease of getting in as a listener, which, I mean, is a very straightforward process as well, which I know some people have, some difficulty figuring out exactly, what a podcast is, and, how to get into the game in that regard as well. But I think, the ability to get in, to start laying down some tape, to start, establishing some credibility by just producing episodes, by, thinking them through, by, reaching out to potential guests, by booking people when you can. I mean, it all kind of builds on itself in a really great way, where, maybe you don't get those guests that you're looking for initially, but maybe once you're, 10 episodes in and you've, figured some things out, established some credibility, shown yourself to be someone who has, ideas worth listening to, maybe then you're able to get those guests, and, you can keep building from there.
Totally. And I think the interesting thing about it is it's kind of a journey that I think you don't really know where it's going to take you, right? And at least for myself, I've gotten the luxury of being able to, go to different conferences, record in person, where literally to record in person, I've just brought my laptop, I bought a second mic, and I bought a little kind of 2-track that was like, I think $150, $200. And I basically plugged the 2 mics into the little 2-track, and then it just USBs into my laptop. And then I basically have, me and the guest or guests on another track. And then I just edit it down into an MP3 and, again, send it. So doing it in person is not necessarily more complicated. It just, obviously, I think it's a little bit more, you need to be a little bit more confident, because it can be a little bit more intimidating if you're doing it in person. But I think if you do that a few times, or maybe you prefer doing it in person, right, with somebody or a few people, you just need to kind of get over that, right? And it just maybe takes a few episodes, or maybe you're fine doing it and feel more comfortable doing it, but you can do it over the phone or in person or both, and it works out just as good, and it's not that much more money to get rolling, and maybe you could probably even do it with one mic. You just maybe have to pass it back and forth.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like, there's all sorts of different sound setups that work well enough for a lot of podcasts. I mean, obviously you run the gamut from really professionalized setups that are, where podcasts are being recorded, in, the kind of environment that radio is recorded in,
totally,
where everything is really controlled. And those podcasts sound great, but I mean, like, the podcasts that are, recorded where you're, over Skype or whatever, people are in totally different parts of the world. I mean, those work too, right? Because I mean, ultimately where you're getting it down to is, some voices, right? I mean, as long as you can clearly hear what people are saying, the point is what they're saying. And I mean, you're going to get close enough, I think, in terms of the sound quality. So, I mean, I often think that, the degree of production that we get in a lot of podcasts and audio content is nice, but I mean, it's so not necessary. And I feel like, it might be worth, driving that point home, that,
totally,
you really don't need to feel overwhelmed by not having all the tools at your disposal that some high-end producers do. It's not necessary. I mean, it's really not to produce compelling content.
Sure. Well, I think the other thing too is when it gets compressed down to an MP3, it doesn't matter if your mic's $100 or $10,000. 99% of people will not be able to tell the difference, right? Unless you're kind of an audio engineer or have a good ear for this stuff, the average person will not be able to tell the difference. It's just the reality of it, right? And you can maybe upgrade your gear over time and, there's a ton of really good kind of content if you just Google it online about how to kind of, what gear you should use starting out, what gear you should use when you're, maybe been doing it for a while. You could even reach out to me. I'll send you a list that I forward to kind of everybody of all the stuff I use. I think just trying to talk more about what it takes to kind of get into this. The other thing that I've really found with kind of podcasters in general, and I think I can't remember one person that I've met that wasn't like insanely supportive and helpful in the space. Like, I guess I got really lucky when I was starting out that I went to a conference in LA, and a girl that actually helped me get another kind of writing gig that I kind of do for a tech blog. I was like, oh, we should go for coffee. We had some phone calls, but I never actually met her in person. And she was like, I'm doing this podcasting panel tonight. You should come. And, the crazy thing is it was just off Hollywood Boulevard. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is amazing. Like this is a kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. And there's 4 or 5 people on the panel. She was moderating the panel. And all these people are talking about these podcasts. Some I heard of, some I hadn't heard of. And the crazy thing about it that I took out of it was these people that were on a panel, some of them had only been doing it 3-4 months, right? And they were already on a panel teaching others how to like be podcasters. And so, and then you talk with all the other people that were just kind of there, and they were in kind of the same boat as me. They were either just starting up or they were kind of been doing it for a while. But just the community around trying to help each other out, at least in my experience, has been amazing, right? Where you ask a question or you say like, how did you do this or that, or what gear or this or that? Like, I've had nothing but people at least get back to you or say, you know what, like, I don't know, but here's somebody that might. Like, I find the community like very supportive of each other. Have you kind of found that as well?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, but stepping into, getting deeper into the Podknife project and the podcast community as a result, you sort of find yourself in, groups on Facebook where,
Sure.
you see all this activity. I mean, just along the lines you're describing, people at various levels of involvement. I mean, people who are just starting out, people who are veterans, who are looking to, impart their wisdom, people who, have met up, as a function of, sort of being a part of these groups, who have, formed networks to, sort of combine their interest in terms of, getting access to advertising and stuff like that. I mean,
Sure.
there's all sorts of, coalescing of interests that happen in these groups. I mean, then, it goes from, the online sort of stuff like we were just mentioning, whether, it's on Reddit or Facebook or wherever you like, to, stuff that's happening in person in, communities all over the place. I mean, where, podcasters from specific areas are getting together. I mean, whether it's, at a massive convention kind of thing, like at a, podcast movement, or whether it's, in smaller kind of just meetups around the country where people are able to, and around the world where people are able to share tips as to, how to deal with various issues that confront people, whether it's a question of technical stuff on the recording end or the distribution end, or, the marketing and, getting the message out there kind of thing. And I completely agree. I mean, it's a really, really supportive community. And I think, to the extent people are, to the extent prospective podcasters are concerned about meeting resistance from people who are already in the game, it's not really like that. I mean, I think, it's incredibly supportive. Everyone has an understanding that, like, not everyone can listen to everyone's podcast.
Sure.
There's just too much. So, I mean, there's not an expectation that when you're coming in, you've listened to, X, Y, and Z, most popular podcasts and can speak about them fluently and all that kind of stuff, which I think is also kind of a helpful thing to keep in mind.
Yep.
I mean, everyone's only listened to a tiny fraction of the podcasts that are out there. And I think everyone is just supportive of, the process, the format, and, people getting what they want to out there.
Sure. So I want to go back to Podknife a little bit. How did you kind of get the first version kind of built? Did you build it yourself? Did you get, some freelancers? Did you hire a team? How did you actually get podknife.com kind of built?
So I did a lot of the database work that sort of serves as the backbone of it on my own.
Okay.
Over time. I mean, this is kind of feeds into stuff I've been doing my whole life, sort of putting together databases and spreadsheets and compiling information from various places. So I was working with that as a backbone, but I'm not a coder at the level that I would trust myself to build a commercial product.
Okay.
So I worked with a technologist friend of mine to sort of sketch out the app in sort of broad strokes. I mean, how it would all fit together, and then got connected with some contractors in Shanghai who have been fantastic, and I've been working with them
Nice.
on the execution of everything that we put together over that time. So it's something that's developed over the course of now better part of 2 years. I mean, year and a half.
That's great.
And we got a lot more to roll out, and but it's been a really productive relationship thus far.
Sure. So you self-funded then? I'm assuming you didn't raise any money? Okay.
That's right. Totally self-funded. And I mean, that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, both for simplicity's sake. I mean, I'm fortunate to have the means to pull together the cash to get that process going, but also to maintain a level of independence. I mean, I think one of the things that I feel good about bringing to the podcasting space is that, I'm not really linked in with any entities within the podcasting world that I need to be favoring over any others. So, I mean, there's no push to, promote, Gimlet shows or something like that. I mean, I'm really trying to be as agnostic as possible and try to, remove my personal preferences from the way things are displayed on the site to the degree possible. I mean, and really make it sort of that even playing field that we were talking about, where your new players in the game are going to be appearing right alongside established podcasts.
Sure. No, I think that's great. And even I just have the site up now, just like you have, like a Android developer podcast next to like a Bloomberg podcast next to like a board game podcast, against a politics podcast. Like, you have a bunch of different stuff. There's a handful of others, but people get the idea. Like to your point, like you're clearly displaying that on the homepage of just a bunch of different podcasts that are, related or unrelated from each other, front and center. The other thing I do want to mention though is, do you have plans to kind of monetize Podknife at some point?
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely in the cards. I mean I'm not sure exactly what path that's going to take. I mean the thought is to run ads on the site at some point.
Sure.
As it continues to develop, and perhaps to offer some sort of premium version of the product as well to users. I mean one of the things that we're working on right now is a more developed side to the site for publishers, so they can get more information about the views that they've been seeing on their pages, the sort of activity that's been happening in the related to their podcasts and other podcasts that are that have tags that are similar to ones that they own. So sort of similar sort of dashboard available to users as time goes on. But I mean those are the ways we're looking to monetize, as opposed to sort of linking in with particular podcast networks or that sort of thing.
Sure. No, that's actually quite interesting. This is kind of off topic, but I'm kind of curious about it. How did you come up with the name Podknife?
Oh yeah, okay. So it is a little bit of a play on Pitchfork, the music website. I mean, I'm a long-time reader of theirs. I like the idea of having that sort of eating implement at the back end, but also I feel like I had to get the word the pod in there for obvious reasons.
Sure.
But also that it's kind of I envision it as a tool akin to a Swiss Army knife type of thing. I mean, one of the things that I'm really proud of on the site as it currently exists is in the search results, where you can really cut up the database. I mean, you mentioned that we have a lot of varied podcasts like right out on the homepage, and that's very much by design, as you noted. But once you get into the search results, you can really cut up the database by a lot of different characteristics. So whether that's by publication frequency, does this podcast come out, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, more periodic than that? Does it, have average episode durations that are, within a certain band? Where is it produced? Those kind of things. So you can really slice up the database to get to something that's much more specific and maybe, what you're looking for exactly.
Sure. And then you also have kind of, if I like this podcast, you also have you also might like podcasts as well listed on everybody's or those podcast pages, which I think is actually really useful for people, right? I use that on kind of music services all the time. It's like, if you like this artist, you're gonna like this. It's the same kind of concept. I find tons of new artists and podcasts that way.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think that's a helpful way to inspire some additional browsing around. And I mean, the idea is, as more information flows into the site, as more podcasts are added, and as we're, better defining what these podcasts are, by way of tags and the customized tags that we're adding, the quality of all that stuff is just going to continue to improve.
Sure. The other thing that I was thinking of mentioning to you, when I first thought of Podknife and when we first kind of connected, my original thought, and you can tell me if it's crazy or not, was, back in the day, you had to slice the tape and then tape it together. That was kind of my original thought of where you came up with the Podknife thing. So it's interesting to know kind of where you got it from, but that's kind of what I thought of originally, which also works.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, I hadn't thought about that one, but maybe I'll work that into the lore of Podknife sometime in the future.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I just thought I would mention it. So I'm kind of curious to know, you've built this kind of network, and where do you kind of think the podcasting space is going to go? Because I don't really necessarily know, but I'm kind of curious to know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think we're going to see more players get into the game. I mean, I feel like, as much as we've seen podcasting grow in, just the last year, and I mean, in the few years prior to that, I mean, I feel like there's just so much more opportunity for growth. I mean, there are people who still like, don't know how to get at a podcast. I mean,
Sure.
even people who are walking around with iPhones and have been for years, they just don't know what's out there, and are intimidated by the prospect of accessing something that they haven't before. And I think it's really helpful to have prominent people moving into the podcasting world that we've seen over and over again, right? I mean, it feels like famous people are coming out with podcasts. I mean, there's announcements along those lines. It seems like every single day.
Sure.
And I think to the extent that is a pathway in for people who maybe don't know as much about podcasts to get in the game, that could be a really fruitful way to continue to sort of broaden the field of people we're trying to reach. And I think that's going to mean more people getting involved in production as well. I mean, it's going to inspire more people to produce their own podcasts, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how networks continue to develop. Because I mean, I think you're continuing to see podcasts that are independent, sort of recognize that they have similar interests to other independent podcasts, and kind of coalesce in these networks that are then able to do a little bit broader promotion, across show promotion, that kind of thing. I mean, from one to another, advertising on one another's shows, or running promos on one another's shows. And I think we're going to see a lot more movement into that sort of connected world where there are more players getting involved, and just more people to reach. And it seems like there's a lot more growth in front of us. I mean, it feels like we're still in the early stages of seeing this all develop. I mean, the fact that a tool like Podknife has felt as necessary as it has to me is an indication that in 2018 there's still a lot of growth to explore. I mean, there's a lot more information to dig out about what these podcasts actually are, and I think we're going to continue to see movement in that direction.
No, that's interesting. I agree with you. I think we're kind of at the early stages. It kind of has become, I hate the word trendy, but I can't really think of a better kind of description that I think the general public will understand. But podcasting's been around for what, 10, 15, maybe even more than that? Is that? Yeah.
I mean, it really has.
So, and I think the simplest way to put it, if you still don't really understand what a podcast is, it's basically just like an on-demand episode. I think that's the simplest way to put it. That you can either live stream that episode, or you can download it to listen to it right now or later. And you can kind of go back in history and listen to past episodes. You can kind of cherry pick episodes if you're like, oh, that episode in this podcast doesn't sound like something I'm interested in. You can listen to one that was recorded a year ago or 3 weeks ago. You can you don't have to listen to every episode. You can pick and choose what you want. Some shows you probably want to listen to every episode because they continue on just like a TV show, but
sure.
Some don't, right? And I think just kind of finding what's interesting to you is really great. I think it's a much needed. I've gotten asked about this before, where people, I've heard from podcasters like, oh, do you think kind of traditional radio is going to die? Personally, I don't. Selfishly, I guess I look at it this way. I create content. So why wouldn't I want my content on today's current mediums? If a medium starts up tomorrow or goes away tomorrow, I will either add my content or take my content away from that. So I think, just being on the most platforms that you see relevant to your show, I think people need to kind of consider that as well. I think also different ages of people and different types of people listen to shows on different mediums. Some people will sit on their desktop and run iTunes or go to podknife.com and just listen in the browser. Some will be on their Android phone, some will be on their iPhone, some will download it some will just say, like, I want to listen to it on FM radio, right? And you tell me what to listen to. So I think, just putting your content on all the different platforms that you think is relevant to your potential audience or the audience that you want to get in front of, I think has been how I've been successful at it anyway. Do you have kind of anything to add to that?
I mean, I think it makes a ton of sense. I mean, your approach. I mean, like, why wouldn't you want to be everywhere where people could, be interested in consuming your content? I mean, yeah. I mean, I think podcasts sort of function as the backbone of that. I mean, I feel like it has maybe longer legs than radio, just in the sense that it's a much more permanent kind of thing than totally. Radio. I mean, has tended to be. So, I mean, you could always run, podcast content on the radio. I mean, if the circumstances called for it. I mean, I love the radio. I mean, I think it's awesome. I mean, I certainly don't want it to go anywhere, but I think, there's just so much less time to fill on a radio station.
Totally.
I mean, the time is limited, right? I mean, you only have, a certain amount of time to work with. And in a podcast format, the open-endedness of it, the fact that you could have a 2-hour long conversation with me here, and there's nothing limiting that aside from people's willingness to listen, right? I mean, and your own constraints on terms of what makes up a good podcast. But I mean, it is truly open-ended in the sense that no one's going to cut you off. And
yep.
I mean, I think being able to take that kind of content and cut it down for the purposes of radio play or something like that. I mean, it really just provides you with some versatility to work off of. That should be durable. I mean, in my mind. I mean, I don't really see why the idea of there being sort of on-demand audio in the way that podcasts are would go away anytime soon.
Totally. I also think too that there's people that do 15-minute podcasts or 10-minute podcasts or 20-minute or 45, right? Like, where if you need to fill radio airtime, like, you need to fill it. And the problem is if you don't listen to that show at 8 a.m. on Tuesday mornings, you basically have to listen to it as a podcast if you miss that episode, right? Like, or like on demand, which is basically a nice podcast. To me, at least, podcast is basically a nice way of saying on-demand content, right? Like, I get people would probably shoot me for that, but I think for the general public, that's basically a simplified version of what it is. It's on-demand content. Fair to say?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, and I think it's on-demand content that maybe more fully reflects what the producer is looking to put out there than and it isn't confined in the same way that you're confined on TV. I mean, I just to get back to the basketball for a
Sure.
moment. I mean,
Sure.
one of the things that I find watching television, the analysis on television, they're so constrained by having to fit what they have to say within commercial breaks and make it applicable to the wide audience that's watching on television. Whereas I mean, if you're doing the same kind of thing in podcast form, you're analyzing the same contest. I mean, you could do it in whatever depth is required for your audience. I mean, you figure out what your audience is looking for, and you give them the amount of depth that they require, and however long that takes, that's how long it takes, right? I mean,
totally.
You can really tune it much more closely to what the people who are listening actually want.
No, I 100% agree. Matt, we're running out of time, so let's close the show with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself and Podknife.
Yeah, absolutely. So, definitely encourage anyone listening to check out podknife.com. That's where you can find the website, or you can check us out on Facebook, and we're probably most active on Twitter at Podknife. And if you have anything to send to me specifically, please feel free to hit me up at matt@podknife.com.
Well, Matt, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. We'll talk soon. Okay, bye. Thanks for listening. Please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. Also check us out on Facebook at Building the Future Show, and follow us on Twitter at Building Show. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com, and keep building the future.